Okay, we're officially starting it. The record button has been hit, so that's my cue to get things going. Welcome everyone to our webinar on exploring compensation in COLA for the Head Start Workforce and Community Action Programs. Like the description on your registration, we know that CAAs across the country work to foster pay equity and manage compensation cost. I could tell you a little bit about my own experience with this in the introductions as well. And that's what we're going to do, is just spend a little bit of time talking about who our host is going to be today and our partnership with Ryan and the National Community Action Partnership. I'm Christina Ellis. I'm the manager of the Academy at NHSA, if you haven't met me yet. I've been with NHSA for just a little over a year. And prior to that, I was in a community action program in Tulsa, Oklahoma called CAP Tulsa, where we really, if you didn't know that there was a difference between Head Start and community action, you wouldn't know anything, because it was all the same, because the pay was the same for the people that were there. So there wasn't any sort of, well, this class is a community action and this is a Head Start, or this is another funding source. And so I know that our panelists today are going to go a little bit more into, well, that sounds lovely, but how does that work in a program? But first, I want to introduce Ryan Gelman. He's the project director for public policy and advocacy at National Community Action Project, and he's going to be our host today and introduce our panelists. So welcome, Ryan.
Thanks, Christina. Hi, everyone. Thanks also to NHSA for helping us put this webinar together. I was at the NHSA conference in May and the CAPLA conference in June. I just feel like everywhere I go, this issue is coming up. So we really appreciate at the National Partnership NHSA's collaborative work with us on this. So as Christina mentioned, my name is Ryan Gelman. I'm the project director for public policy and advocacy at the National Community Action Partnership. I also staff our Head Start task force, which brings together community action executive directors and Head Start directors from all the ACF regions across the country to talk about issues facing Head Start programs in community action agencies. We're also joined by Jennifer Godfrey and Stacy Waite, from Utah Community Action, as well as Arlene Dobson from the Agricultural and Labor Program Inc. in Florida. They're going to share some successful strategies for addressing compensation challenges for Head Start programs in CAAs. We're also joined by two CAP law attorneys, Veronica Zhang and Caroline Santilli, and they're going to go over some rules and guidance surrounding compensation and staff incentives. I think everyone here understands this issue extremely well. They live it every day, but just want to, sort of like situate us here. I think everyone on this webinar knows the average Head Start teacher salary is about 35 grand a year. I think the median elementary school teacher salary is about 60, maybe a little bit over 60. NHSA did a poll at their 2022 annual conference that found that 90% of people responding to the poll said that their programs have closed classrooms permanently or temporarily due to lack of staff. Over half said that compensation is the #1 reason for staff leaving. Compensation is a huge issue for Head Start programs right now, especially with, transitioning possibly out of these flexibilities and into full enrollment again. And also there's still funding out there. So I think only about half of the COVID appropriations money is spent. I think almost 70%, according to OHS, of the American Rescue Plan Act money is still unspent, 70%. So there is money out there, but basically being able to offer multiple programs that directly address community needs is unique to community action agencies, but it does create challenges for compensation equity between programs. So today we're going to hear from a couple of agencies that found successful strategies for dealing with that. And then we'll flip it over to Cap Law for some rules and guidance. So with that, I will hand it over to Jennifer and Stacy from Utah Community Action.
All right, Ryan, can you guys see our slide deck okay?
I can see, yeah, it looks good.
Thank you. So I am Jennifer Godfrey. I am the CEO here at Utah Community Action.
And I'm Stacy Waite. I am the Chief Administrative Officer here at Utah Community Action.
So we wanted to share with you a little bit about who we are and how this journey, how we really became upon this journey that we have been on the last, really, I'm going to say 4 years. And so Utah Community Action, we are obviously a CAP agency that is dedicated to fighting poverty at its root causes, like many of you on the call today. We run 6 core programs: our adult education, case management and housing, which for us does include homeless services, Head Start, heat, nutrition, and weatherization. We have roughly 650 staff, and we are about $52 million, of which 27 million of that is from our Head Start program. And so just to give you an idea of the size of our agency, there was a lot of things to take into consideration and a lot of funding sources, which Stacy will speak to here in a little bit, that we had to learn to navigate. So our journey started really back in 2018 as we were preparing for our strategic plan. And our strategic plan is what we have here before you. This is the 1-page roll-up. But there was a lot of conversations that were had during this time that led us into equitable practices and really stepping back and looking at the work that we were doing here at Utah Community Action and how we go about working together. Now, as I shared with you, we have 6 core programs, and I will say prior to this journey, they were 6 core silos of excellence where we were doing great work, but we weren't necessarily doing that work together. And an example of this would be coordinated intake and trauma-informed practices. So if we had clients coming into our space, and let's say they were receiving Head Start services, but also reaching out to our case management and housing team, they would do 2 separate intakes. And as we all know, repeating their story over and over and over. And so it really gave us the opportunities to start to look at and step back and say, what are some of the practices that we've had in place? And what is it we're striving to really be? And how would we like the community, our staff, and our clients to experience services through Utah Community Action? And there was a lot of conversations with our board as we engaged in this dialogue. And of utmost importance to us was equitable practices across the board for all of the departments, because of course, everybody can see it through their lens and they could see what their needs were, but we couldn't see our needs as an agency. So it really gave us the opportunity to engage in a lot of reflective work and dialogue together. And it was not only what are the practices that we have in place, and I do not think this is unique to us, but all of us have practices that we have in place that aren't in writing anywhere, but they've always been there. We've always done that. And so it was really looking at what is it we have always done? Is it currently meeting our needs? Is it efficient practices? And are there other ways to go about this? And so really looking at that, and I use the term as out of the box thinking, just what are our other options? Or if we're going to stay within the parameters of the box, do we only see one option, or are there others that we can look at? The other thing that we spent a lot of time on, and I will say it continues to ebb and flow, is our personnel policies. What are the current practices we have in place versus what are the best practices? And what is it we too need to look at? What is ever changing as it pertains to information and guidance, such as guidance from Whitfley, that we want to take into, or CAP law that we want to take into account when we're looking at our personnel policies? And does that currently reflect the current situation and what's taking place? I think the last piece, as we really started to dive into some of this reflective work, is around having some really hard conversations. And I would say this took us a little bit of time to get our leadership to the place where, as we were coming together as an agency, as one core program as Utah Community Action, rather these 6 silos of excellence that I shared with you, it was, we're having these conversations and our beliefs and opinions and views are going to be challenged, and that is okay. And it's not meant to be done so in a manner that is personal. It's really these conversations are really to ensure that we have the best practices, but we also understand some of the other views that we may not bring to the table and capitalize on those strengths that as a team we have together. And so as we started to evolve as an agency, it really came down to, we are so much stronger together as one. And I share that with you because obviously our Head Start program, having families that are at 100% of poverty level or even up to 130%, qualify for every other funding source that is coming through this agency, which typically is between 125 and 200% of poverty. And so really identifying, how do we provide these holistic and wraparound services to our families that are so much in need, rather than have them try to navigate one more system? What is it that we as an agency can bring to them that is unique? And what is unique is that we are one stop here at Utah Community Action, and we do have what we refer to as service hubs where they can get all those services in one place. But that, again, took us some time to get there. So before we really jump into before I turn it over to Stacey and she can share with you all the amazing stuff as it pertains to finance, I think there's some things here that were important to me just to speak to before we jump into that. And that is, finance really needs to be included in every conversation that you're having up to this point. And Stacey and I look at this very uniquely, that we're in lock and step all the time when it becomes to the direction the agency is going. And we're able to have those hard conversations that need to be had, or those crazy ideas that pop out of the sky, and engage in those conversations together because we know what the ultimate direction is that we're moving forward with as an agency. And our team is there along with it as well. Our fiscal managers are meeting with the program managers so they too understand what it is they're trying to accomplish. So to make sure that strategic alignment is always in place, but also knowing there's costs associated with change. And what does that look like? And that finance team can really guide us on, what does this cost look like and what is it we need to prepare for? And as I kind of alluded to, the relationship that we have is really established on trust, and knowing that we have to have that foundational relationship in order for us to better meet the needs of our program. And so that is very important to both Stacey and I. And everything we're doing is really within the best interest of the agency. So when we start to talk about some of these equitable practices that I'll let Stacey speak to, you'll see some of that.
So I love what Jen talked about in terms of the strategic portion of our agency, and that really is the overview that gives us a roadmap that guides everything else. But once we have that in place, it's time to get down to the nuts and bolts of how do we pay for what we want to do. And there's a lot of different factors to take into consideration when you're looking at the funding and what goes into that. The first of those is grant compliance. As you all know, you are subject to many, many requirements. Here at Utah Community Action, at any given point in time, we can have up to 100 different grants or funding sources, which is a lot, and they all have their own separate rules. And so the key for us is we have to know our funding sources. The fiscal team has to know them, the program team has to know them. We absolutely have to know what is allowed in each of those funding sources because they do all look a little bit different. And as we become more familiar with what the compliance looks like for those, then we can start to get creative around how do we utilize those to fulfill some of our strategic plans or accommodate as things change. The second thing we look at is, what does our policy allow? The last couple of years, we have had to continually review and revise our policies and procedures, both our personnel, our fiscal policies, and look to guidance for that. Ask questions, talk to your advisors, because you have to ensure that your policies allow what you're doing. For example, there's been a lot of fiscal flexibilities Head Start has come out with lately over the last couple of years, specifically with COVID. And if your policy does not support the things you're doing, you're going to have issues. So we are continually monitoring and revising and looking to advisors to ensure that our policies allow those things that we are able to do and those flexibilities. The next thing that is absolutely critical for us is, are we braiding our funding? So again, we have anywhere from 50 to 100 different funding sources. And so we look at how we can braid those funding sources together. So if maybe one grant doesn't allow it, maybe one grant does, and we can braid those funding sources together. And it really goes back to that compliance, knowing your grants, knowing what's in your grants, and being able to utilize them as you need to, and as you need to be flexible. The next thing to consider is the type of training that needs to take place. And this is really more internally with our program managers. So we have a great relationship between our fiscal team and our program managers, who are constantly talking about the grants. What does it allow? What does the budget look like? And really making sure that those program managers know what their funding sources cover. The other critical piece of involving your program managers is really getting them to think ahead and think forward. So for example, right now we know that in Congress, they're looking at doing another COLA for Head Start for next year. So as we're working with maybe our weatherization manager or heat program manager, we're telling them to think ahead. As you're writing your budget for your next grant cycle, put a COLA in your budget. We don't know what it's going to be. It's anybody's guess. But if we're planning ahead and we're communicating that, and we are working with our funding sources, we have to get them to think ahead. And if we're getting our program managers to think 12 months out, then as they're writing their budgets on an annual basis, which most of our grants, we're able to revise our budgets annually. We're just writing that in there because we know that's coming. We're guessing a little bit of a crystal ball there, but it allows us a little bit of flexibility when we get those grants agency-wide. The last point on here is the sustainability. We have a very great practice in place that we will never use one-time funding for ongoing costs. So for example, if we are giving looking at giving a COLA, we will not use one-time funding to do that. We try really hard not to hire people with one-time funding unless it's absolutely critical, but really ensuring that the decisions you're making today are sustainable for the long term and not utilizing one-time funding sources for ongoing things. Some of the ways that we're able to do that is look at alternatives, like maybe a retention bonus, things like that we can do for right now that doesn't create long-term problems that we can't afford to do on a continual basis. When we look at those types of enhancements that we're making in those changes, we strive to create equitable practices for everyone. If we give a COLA in Head Start, everyone in the agency gets a COLA. We have a culture that we maintain that we treat everybody the same agency-wide and really create that equity. So some of the things that we've worked on over the last couple of years with regards to the equity are listed here. And for example, one of those is our winter break pay. So historically, our Head Start teachers have had a little bit of a winter break between, you stop in right before the holiday and begin after the new year. And with that, we paid our teachers for that break. And over the last few years, we've created equity agency-wide so that everybody in the agency gets the same break that Head Start gets. We create that equity across the agency so everybody gets winter break and is paid over that portion of time. And we close all programs in the agency that we're able to close that don't require services at that time. We look at doing one-time bonuses, such as maybe a retention bonus, a referral bonus. And again, everyone in the agency is eligible for those. We plan in advance and talk with our funding sources to ensure that we're able to do that with all of them so that we can ensure all staff are treated equitably. We've also created a little bit of flexibility with our 401k. So we revised our 401k plan to allow for a discretionary contribution. So at the end of some of our grant cycles, if we have some excess benefit money, we utilize that and pay a 401k discretionary contribution. Again, everyone in the agency is eligible. Everyone in the agency gets it. And I've already mentioned the cost of living. If we do a cost of living for one program, we do a cost of living for everybody in the agency. And that requires communication between fiscal and the programs and ensuring that all of the funding sources can afford to do that. talking a little bit about sustainability. One of the things that is absolutely critical is understanding what is happening in the environment. You have to be listening to what's happening in Washington, D.C. You've got to look at what your local funding sources are doing. Maybe you've got some, the city, the state, the county that are doing things. Make a seat for yourself at that table. And that's what we've been able to do is get in on those conversations. So as they're talking about funding potential opportunities, we're at the table and we know what's coming. And that helps us to create that sustainability because we're paying attention to those things around us. And that really is where that funding is coming in. Another opportunity for you is to look at the revenue you're generating. Could you potentially look at things your agency could do that can create revenue for you? We have several different sources of things that we're doing that create revenue for our agency. And sometimes it's minimal, but every little bit counts when we are creating that sustainability and allowing us flexibility to create that equity agency wide. The next is don't be afraid to make asks. If you have funding sources that typically give you, let's say, a $50,000 grant, ask for 75. The worst thing that they can do is tell you no, but you won't know if you don't ask. And if you can create that compelling story for them to help understand what you're trying to do, oftentimes we will find that we will get the higher ask if we're just willing to go forward and ask. And it is really all about strategy and being fluid and not getting stuck where you are, but really allowing yourself that opportunity to look at potential and being open to possibilities and not being afraid to move forward to create that equity so that you can sustain that staff and those decisions that you're making. So as we're looking at the current landscape right now, we are in no different position than all of the rest of you. One of the critical things for us right now is securing and retaining talent. If any of you are out there looking for a position, we're hiring. We can go to our website. There are many positions available. We'd love to have you. But really looking at what can we do as an agency to secure and retain talent. We are also looking at our wage comparability study, and there are regulatory requirements about how often you have to do that, but maybe you have to do it a little more often so that you understand what the current environment is. If the regulation is every 2 years, maybe you should do it every year right now in this current environment as things are changing, and really ensuring that you know what that looks like. Preparing for that COLA, again, you have to look out 12 to 18 months. You've got to write those in your budgets, make sure they're in your grants, use your crystal ball a little bit and talk to your funding sources to see what flexibilities you have to shift around budgets so that you can create that equity with all your employees.
And I'll just share in regards to the employee and employer experience. The last couple of years, many of us obviously shifted to adapt our services to meet the ever-changing community needs, but we also did it to survive. And during that period of time, it did change the expectations that staff have in regards to the employer, and it also changed our experience as an employer for our staff. And so knowing that, it is imperative that we are just being mindful of the conversations and dialogue that are currently taking place and really paying attention to that and knowing what are our expectations as an organization and how does this look for our teams. Those are ever changing. And then the last piece we have here for you is just continuing to move forward. And Stacy framed it beautifully here a second ago. This is all about being fluid and making sure that we are ready and to adapt to the changes that are being made. And we are in a position as an agency to make sure we can sustain the changes that we are making. So thank you for allowing us the opportunity to share some of the work that we have done here at Utah Community Action. But those things did take us time, and they did not necessarily come without their own hardships.
Thanks, Jen. Thanks, Stacy. I think now we're going to hold questions till the end, but we're going to pivot over to Arlene Dobson from the Agricultural and Labor Program in Florida.
Thanks, Ryan. Can you see my slides as well?
Yes.
Wonderful,
Yeah.
wonderful. So again, thank you to NHSA and NCAP for allowing me the opportunity to share some of our practices and projects that we put together that have resulted positively for the organization. Again, my name is Arlene Dobson. I am the CEO for the Agricultural and Labor Program, and we are located in Lake Alfred, Florida. Okay. And today I'm going to discuss a little pertaining to my screen stop sharing. Are you able to see the screen?
I can't see it anymore. Yeah.
Just went away. Let's see if I can find it again. My apologies. Oh no.
It was there. It was there.
But now it's gone.
Yeah.
Hold on.
And Arlene, I can pull it up and be the driver too, and
Please.
share my screen. It's pulling up right now.
Okay.
And I can do that too.
Thank you. Technology, it just died.
Yeah.
Okay, it is loaded now on my screen and I will begin sharing. It is taking a while. There we go.
And I hate to say next slide, but we're going to have to say next slide.
We'll
Please.
do it. We'll get through it. Thanks, Arlene.
Thank you. So next slide. And again, I'm going to speak about pay equity at our organization and the organization realignment, what led to the pay equity. If you can keep going, Christina. Yes. And so the reorganization, the realignment for ALPI, it actually began in 2019. What we did is we looked at the processes that we had in place to include the leftover, so the balance that we had in our budget for salaries and wages, in addition to fringe benefits which are intertwined. And so in 2019, ALPI realigned the organization for the purpose of improving the efficiency and effectiveness of the organization. We found that we were still providing those quality services to the community, but with even not having a full staff in all of the programs at the organization. The restructuring of the organization resulted in a more streamlined operation for our long-term success. And it also allowed us to amend our pay grades, so the salary schedule that we currently had in place. Next slide. And so how did we do that? One of the things in the realignment, we looked at those balances that we found in all of our programs. We found that we were never fully staffed. We always had a balance in all of the programs across the organization. We did not look at the organization as it relates to programs. We looked at it as the agriculture and labor program, one organization providing those quality services regardless of the services that were being provided. And so initially what we did is we looked at those budget. We brought in the human resources director, the finance director, and the division directors. We looked at those budgets and we found that we had those roles that were duplicated. And so they were very close as it relates to their job functions. And by doing that, we were able to shave off. We started with 244 employees. We are now at 204 employees. We eliminated roles that had similar duties, which gave us room to provide increases across the board, organization-wide. We were able to give a cost of living increase still today, and 2 incentives were built into the budget annually. And we did that again by reassessing the budget and reallocating those dollars and being very creative, of course, within regulation to provide those additional incentives to the employees. Next slide. Can you hit it one more time for me, Christina? And so this is a sample of our allocation plan. Again, in the budget annually, we build in cost of living increases and 2 one-time incentives that are approved and they're granted to the employees. The cost of living incentive or increase is based on the Head Start's approval. So if Head Start provides, if they give a 3% increase, we provide that 3% increase organization-wide. However, even if Head Start doesn't give an increase in a given year, we have built into our program a 3% increase each year to give to the employees as a COLA. So although Head Start drives the increase, it's built into the budget to provide a cost of living increase for at least 3% annually. We provide 2 professional development incentives. One is a professional development improvement incentive, and it's based on your education, professional certificate, certifications that an employee may receive, and at least 15 training hours. If an employee qualifies for that incentive, they will receive a one-time incentive pay of at least 1.5%, depending on what that progression is, up to 2.5%. And then lastly, we provide an essential pay incentive, and this is directly correlated with our disaster recovery plan. So all essential workers, so that's organization-wide, we are essential employees, will receive a one-time 4.5% incentive that's based on the CPI of that year. Next slide. And so this pay equity also led into our staff retention. Currently, ALPI has a less than 1% attrition rate, and the terminations per month, the highest that we've had would have been in January of 2022, which are 10 employees. However, I can tell you that those employees that are leaving the organization are more so through retirement due to health reasons. And then we have a few that are leaving their employment to go elsewhere. And so for us, it was important for us to find out why those employees were leaving ALPI to find employment elsewhere. And that leads into my staff retention plan. Next slide, please. The next slide. Okay, retention highlights. And so the first thing we knew we had to do would get feedback from or buy-in from our employees. And so we actually send out surveys to employees to get their wants. We wanted to know how they were feeling. And what we found is that many of the employees were not leaving because of the agriculture and labor program. They were not leaving a job, they were leaving people. And so we found that we needed to provide some type of ongoing leadership training to ensure that our supervisors, our managers were effectively communicating, and that they had the leadership skills in which they were actually providing those assistance in. Again, we provided some work-life balance. We created flexible work schedules. We implemented summer hours. We reduced the work hours, which ultimately increased their hourly rates. And the summer hours turned into a 4-day work week with the employees being out on Fridays. And then I think I have one more. Yeah. And then we have competitive wages. We did a wage comparability study, and I can tell you that we are very competitive. Our lowest wage for any employee is $15 per hour. So in summary, I just say that reassess your organization and look at the overall absolute needs of your organization, adjust your budget in accordance with that. You have to build in that work-life balance. The mental health piece for the employees is very important. They're extremely tired, but they're committed to what it is that we do. And survey your employees. You have to know what it is that they like and what they want, what their needs are. You'll be surprised that many of them are not saying that it is based on their salaries and or their wages. I hope I kept you on task. Ms.
You
Ellen
definitely
and
did. You
Ryan,
definitely did. Thank you.
I did that really, really quick.
Even with that hiccup in the beginning, we're so good. Thank you.
Wonderful.
Yeah,
Thank you.
that's great stuff. Yeah, I mean, staff, I'm sure that Caroline is going to talk about this, but you know, staff wellness is so important. And you know, OHS did put out information about that late last year. So now we're going to turn to Caroline and Veronica from CAPLA to talk a little bit about the rules around these compensation and incentive issues and some guidance as well. And maybe some hypos, right? At least one.
Yes, hypos always. Lawyers we love hypos.
Yep.
Thank you, Ryan. Can you see my slide? Full screen?
Yes.
Okay. Great. So thank you, Ryan, and thank you so much to our CAA presenters. It's been really interesting to hear about what you're doing around employee retention and compensation strategies. So what I'm going to do is provide a very quick overview of some of the rules of thumb that govern the allowability of certain salary-related expenses under your federal funding sources. And you know, for the agencies on the call, you likely receive Head Start funding and CSBG funding. You may also receive other sources of funding. But we're gonna, and as has been mentioned, you should be thinking about the allowability of charging these costs to all of the funding sources that you're going to be charging. And you should be treating the costs consistently according to the benefit, the ways that each employee's salary benefits each award. So for the COLA increases, you know, which we've mentioned, really what we're thinking about in terms of a COLA is a permanent salary or wage increase to reflect the rising cost of goods and services over time. And as you all know, this is kind of built into the Head Start funding model. There will be specific appropriations for a COLA increase for Head Start staff. And we've heard from agencies on the call today that sometimes they'll have CAAs will have a policy of increasing all of their staff salaries commensurate with the Head Start COLA increase. We should note that you don't have to provide that across the board COLA increase when Head Start allocates money for COLA. In fact, the Head Start Act says that, you know, when COLA funds are appropriated for use by Head Start programs, you must provide that COLA to Head Start employees, even if you can't provide it to your other staff. So another topic that we've been getting a lot of questions about at CAPLA, especially since there's been this kind of unprecedented influx of one-time supplementary funding, is the question of incentive pay. And so what we mean by incentive pay is a temporary discretionary increase in pay, which you can contrast to a permanent salary increase. And the uniform guidance says that incentive compensation is allowable if it is based on cost reduction or efficient performance, suggestion awards, safety awards, et cetera, if the compensation is reasonable and if the grantee has a written agreement in place before the services were rendered. So this is the section, you can see here, it's 2 CFR section 200.430 that governs incentive compensation. And OCS actually, so Head Start has explicitly issued guidance that I'm going to cite in a later slide about the allowability of incentive compensation for Head Start employees. But it was only recently at the end of last week that OCS, which is the federal funding source that oversees community services block grant funding, issued guidance on incentive compensation. So basically, this guidance says that incentive compensation is an allowable cost using CSBG funding, as long as you can see here in the second paragraph, as long as the agencies are issuing payments that are reasonable based on a permissible purpose, such as the ones that are listed in the regulation, note that it doesn't necessarily have to be one of those four. It can be a different purpose. And that the additional compensation was provided pursuant to an established written policy that was in place before the incentive was earned. So what that means is you can't retroactively pass an incentive compensation policy. And also you can't decide at the end of a grant year, oh, I have this extra money, let me do a bonus payment. Because in that case, your employees have already worked through the entire grant year. And so they were not, that you didn't have a policy in place when they were earning the incentive award. So there's kind of this time principle here, and there's also a permissible purpose for awarding incentive compensation. So I'm gonna just run through a couple of cap laws tips for drafting an incentive compensation policy, just to get you familiar with what that might look like. As always, the incentive compensation should be paid consistently with employee salaries. So you want to make sure that you're familiar with all of the funding source rules for using your different types of funding. But overall, when you're drafting an incentive compensation policy, you want to make a connection to ideally one of those uniform guidance listed permissible purposes for providing incentive compensation. And those are cost reduction, efficient performance, suggestion awards, or safety awards. And the Departmental Appeals Board at the Department of Health and Human Services has issued a number of different decisions about various disallowances of incentive compensation. And one of the things that they've noted is what is not an allowable purpose for incentive compensation. You can see here, making up for historically low salaries, recognizing job seniority or length of service, unexpected grant funds at the end of the year. And you can contrast that to what they have said is a supportable purpose for incentive compensation, such as above average job performance and successful cost cutting efforts.
Caroline, if I could just jump in quickly here. I think sometimes people get stuck in this table because they look at the column on the right and they say, but one of the reasons we want to provide incentive compensation is one of those purposes that's under the disallowed column. And I think the way that we would respond to that is that should not be the only stated purpose in your incentive compensation policy. It can be one of the reasons that you're providing incentive compensation. So you can easily kind of conclude, especially with the statistics that Ryan provided at the outset of this webinar, that salaries for Head Start programs and for a lot of community action agency staff have been historically low. And so we are trying to bring up salaries. That can be something that is known in your agency, that you talk about in your agency. That should not be the only explicit purpose of your incentive compensation policy. If you can tie the purpose to one of the ones that are in the uniform guidance as an allowable purpose, you can have a secondary purpose being to increase historically low salaries, or because we have one-time grant funding that we can use this year that we didn't have last year. So again, this is not you cannot have any of those as your purpose. They just cannot be your only purpose.
Thanks, Veronica. I also saw actually, I'll get to this in a couple slides. I think another important aspect of an incentive compensation policy is that you have identified what it takes to earn the incentive. And we refer to these as the incentive criteria. These are the preconditions that must be met by an employee in order to earn the incentive, and they should be objective and realistic and linked to the CAA's accomplishment of its exempt purpose. They should be applied on an individual employee basis. And if they're applied to a group of employees, you should be able to show that each recipient of the incentive met the incentive criteria. So overall, under your written policy, total compensation must be reasonable. This is just a general rule from the uniform guidance is that employee compensation should be reasonable overall. You should consider incentives that are paid to comparable workers in similar situations. And you should, we recommend also imposing certain, sometimes monitors like to see that you have a safeguard in place such as a cap for total incentive compensation for each employee, or a right by the board to adjust incentive compensation in light of, changing circumstances, et cetera. That's mentioned here again, board oversight, the board having the sole discretion to cancel or reduce awards. I think one of the most important things here is that you get your board's approval and that you approve the policy in advance of the incentive being earned. That means also applying the funding or charging the costs to the proper grant period, which in this case would be the grant period in which the incentive criteria were met by the particular employee. Make sure that you're applying the plan consistently to all of your employees. And this could involve, in factoring in earning an incentive. So it could include documentation from employee reviews, or other documentation that you create to kind of gauge progress on earning these different incentives. We also recommend that you call you call it, and you call your policy incentive policy, or we've seen in the decisions, some community action agencies try to get around these rules by calling their bonuses something other than a bonus. But just want to emphasize that the Departmental Appeals Board will look at any one-time lump sum payment to employees as an incentive compensation issue. You want to make sure that you're documenting each employee's meeting of the incentive criteria, and also make sure that you're reporting compensation properly on your Form 990. Before we move on, we got some great questions in the chat. How do you show that employees were justified in their receipt of incentives? Appraisal reviews. So this kind of gets back to this document question. There have been a number of different ways that CAAs have supported incentive awards. In one case in particular, there was a rating system that was established by a written policy passed by the board, or it might not have actually been the board. It could have been like the HR department came up with an sort of a grading system or a rubric for evaluating employee performance that would grade employees on a scale of 1 to 5. And then the employees that received awards of a 3, 4, or 5 were given the incentive for above average performance, 3 being the average here. So that's one example. You can also use professional development as a justification for incentive pay. So if you have employees who are earning a particular certification, you could have documentation showing that they earned that certification, and keep that with their file to show that to document their earning of the incentive. Angie has a great suggestion. Employee performance reviews can play a great role here. You can set goals in an employee performance review and then identify that those goals have been met or not been met in the following performance review. And that establishes a documented and recorded record of the employees meeting or exceeding performance goals that you set for them.
And performance goals can also be less qualitative and more objective. So it could be, for instance, if our LIHEAP team, or if we're talking about staff other than Head Start, our LIHEAP team has processed a number of applications, in a week or during this particular season, then an incentive compensation is awarded for everyone who's on that team. So it can be based on a performance review, but it can also just be based on hitting some sort of metric or objective.
Great. Okay, so as I mentioned, Head Start has come out explicitly in support of incentives, including hiring bonuses, hazard pay, return to work incentives, retention bonuses, or temporary increases in pay. They said in their in their employee compensation guidance that all of these incentives must be reasonable and subject to an established written policy. And they have also issued guidance that specifically encourages Head Start agencies to offer incentives that are substantial enough to compete with the incentives that are offered by elementary schools and other competitor employers, which I think is really interesting considering, as Brian mentioned earlier, sometimes this gap between what between the average, Head Start teacher salary and a elementary school salary. So the Head Start has acknowledged that the amounts that may be paid under the current circumstances, of this particular economy that we find ourselves in, are different, and that the awards may be justifiably larger than they have been in the past. So quickly, before maybe we turn to more questions or our hypo, I'll give Ryan the chance to decide how he wants to handle the last 10 minutes. But I just want to mention also that hazard pay is an allowable expense under, hazard pay is not mentioned in the Uniform Guidance or the CSBG Act or the Head Start Act. So as lawyers, we would look to apply the general compensation rule for hazard pay, which is that total compensation be reasonable, that the compensation be paid under an established written policy and supported by sufficient documentation. So this is a way that some agencies have been compensating their staff for the increased risk of exposure to COVID-19 that they face by coming into work in person. So it's another method of providing that additional consideration of how hard employees are working without some of the added criteria that you might see in an incentive compensation policy. Again, with hazard pay, you want to make sure that it's your frontline and essential workers who are in the office who are receiving the compensation due to their increased risk of infection. Make sure that you establish a time frame for providing the additional compensation. Make sure that total compensation is reasonable, and make sure that you have a written policy that you are applying consistently to each and every employee. So Ryan, I want to give you a chance to, I don't know if there's any additional questions that have come in for us or for our CAA presenters.
We can go, you want to go ahead and do the hypo, and then we can move to questions after that. There weren't too many in the chat, but so we can do the hypo and then just move over to questions.
Great. So we have a very short hypo here, and would love it if you would put your answers in the chat or your thoughts, or just kind of share what your take is. And hopefully this can spur some additional questions from folks. So let's say that we have a Head Start agency and there's an employee named Sasha. She conducts home visits on behalf of the agency. COVID numbers are rising again in the community, and she's worried about potential health risks. And so you identify Sasha as someone who's maybe at risk of leaving your agency. How can you try to retain Sasha? Lori says, encourage vaccination. That's a wonderful idea. I think, yes, it can definitely reduce your risk of severe infection to be vaccinated. Allowing virtual visits. Okay, yep, I'm also seeing hazard pay. Yeah. Give her all the PPE possible. Yes. So vaccinations, hazard pay, and providing free personal protective equipment like masks, face shields, etc. Those are all great methods for retaining Sasha in this particular scenario. Now, I think Arlene mentioned, like, being in conversation with your employees. We wouldn't have necessarily known that Sasha was worried about the increasing COVID numbers in the community if we didn't ask her. So having regular conversations about what your employees want out of work and how that changes over time is really important. Okay, so now your other staff have found out that you're going to pay Sasha more, and now they want a salary increase. Like let's say you're giving Sasha a salary increase to incentivize her staying with the agency, or you've decided to award her some hazard pay for, the duration of the public health emergency, for example. Do you have to offer your other staff hazard pay or incentive pay now that they have found out about what Sasha is getting? Anyone have any thoughts? You can put them in the chat. Dr. B says, are they doing the same job? That's a great question. So I think there are, if they're doing the same job, you might want to think about, whether the employees are, you might want to talk to a lawyer and think about what it looks like in terms of, do you have any employees who are not being offered the incentive who are part of a protected class? But there, if we've seen this also in terms of home visits with Head Start and also weatherizing houses, those two groups of employees are, subject to some of the same COVID-19 exposure risks, but they are supported by funding sources with very different rules when it comes to hazard pay and incentive compensation. We have the Office of Head Start on one hand, which has actively encouraged and had an explicit stance on hazard pay, whereas the Department of Energy has not issued any guidance and has not been responsive to questions about hazard pay. So in that case, you have a business reason, which is a funding source rule, for not providing hazard pay to your weatherization employees when you might offer it to your Head Start home visitors. And so there's funding source rules are going to vary from funding source to funding source, and you can from a morale perspective, obviously it might not be ideal, but you can offer different incentives to employees based on how their salaries are funded. Veronica, did you want to add anything to that?
I was going to address one of the comments that came in the chat about employees discussing salaries. And, you do have an obligation under labor laws to allow employees to talk about the conditions of their workplace, and that can include staff salaries. And so, it's not uncommon, I think, for staff to be chatting about incentive pay or, raises that they might get. And so I think that this is, I think, the issue why, folks are probably on the call today is kind of struggling with one funding source that they receive being particularly encouraging of pay increases, while others have not been or have been more resistant. And I think a lot of the practical solutions that Jennifer and Stacy and Arlene shared at the beginning of this call are really helpful. And I think my big takeaway from that is you have to plan ahead and think about this not just as a one-time, sort of fix on the problem, but are you going to have a policy going forward of applying pay increases equitably across your programs? And if that's something that's important to your staff, and it seems like it has become more and more important across the network, then it does take some thinking and planning ahead. And also, I think with engaging your funding sources to share that, we don't just do weatherization, or we don't just do Head Start. And so we need to be able to support other staff in our agency who are doing similar work. I think that's part of this kind of process of planning for pay increases as well.
Yeah, that's a great point. I think that also kind of touches on a question that just came in about, what happens when you remove a temporary policy like this? And that is, I think that is something that folks are going to have to think about, in terms of long-term planning for compensation. There are other ways that you can work in, certain employee morale considerations. One of them is fringe benefits or a permanent salary increase. And those types of compensation are also addressed in CAP law's building blocks of employee compensation resource. So I encourage you all to check that out. It's basically an interactive guide on our website that contains all of the information I've covered here today and some links to where you can find the rules for each type of employee compensation. And we included the Head Start rules and the CSBG rules in this resource. So you can check this out for more guidance on what specific rules apply to compensation of your employees at your agency.
Yeah, and I think this question of how do you have employees not see removal of the incentive compensation as a pay cut? This is where, when we say call it what it is, really matters. It matters both for your kind of funding source compliance, because if it's not incentive compensation and you don't call it incentive compensation, you're not subject to the kind of additional incentive compensation requirements where you have to have a permissible purpose. I mean, in terms of increasing salaries permanently, you have a lot more flexibility with that. I mean, you have wage comparability issues, of course, with Head Start and just kind of the general IRS rules, tax rules around, reasonable compensation, but you don't have to have a purpose specifically for that. And so you do have flexibility there. You should call it as it is.
Yeah, that's great.
I'm just going to jump in because I just want to be respectful of folks' time, but because we are at 2 o'clock. But I just wanted to just to sort of wrap up. I think something that we heard, I think, from everybody is just that I think I can't remember, all these conferences run together, but someone once asked it recently, like everyone's always saying get creative, but what does that mean? Get creative, right? I think that what we heard from everyone is that this is a systemic get creative. It's not a moment in time get creative. It's a take a minute, reflect on what you have, what policies are in place, what programs you're running, what are the rules around each program, and then try to create an honest, open discussion about a policy that would work for everyone moving forward. I think that's just a really sort of like motivational piece of information, at least for me, to be honest. Just want to say thank you. Well, first of all, thank you to NHSA for co-hosting this webinar with NCAP. And then also obviously to our panelists, to Arlene and Jen and Stacy, and to Caroline and Veronica, thank you so much. And we're going to send out a copy of the slides to everyone who registered. If you have, I'm sure I'm going to hand it to Christina just like for full wrap up in a second. But as always, if you have any additional questions or, are looking for contact info or more information on something, please feel free to email me. I'm pretty sure my contact info is in the slides, but if it's not, I'll put it right here in the chat as well. I just think that this is a great opportunity for future NHSA and CAP law collab on these issues. So I'll hand it back over to Christina and I'll pop my email into the chat as well.
Thanks, Ryan. And I just want to echo what Ryan said and thank our presenters today, but also thank Ryan and NCAP for coming together so quickly and how these things work out, where you meet at a conference and you talk about things. And before you know it, we've got, 5 people presenting fantastic information. And so I think the future of this partnership moving forward looks really great on this topic. And I appreciate all of you for taking time out of your day on a Monday to come listen to the presenters on this important topic. So thank you all and enjoy the rest of your day.
Thanks, everyone.